and David is fine with being recorded. I'll double confirm that, but yes, he said that was okay. So.
Members and supporting our community. $10. Impact on all do our part. Your membership next goes that much farther in strengthening OPB. So we continue to provide you information.
3 o'clock.
Expect the programs like Here and Now, particularly with Think Out Loud, coming up in just a few minutes after our newscast. 1-800-245-2346 or go online to opb.org.
David, just confirming that it's okay if we record this session. We might play it at a future one.
Sure.
Great.
Stand up for news that matters. OPB is able to deliver the kinds of news and information
Not.
you have come to expect, and imagine what more we can do with you and your support next. Make that contribution. Makes a huge difference, and it is so easy to set up. $10 a month or more in our sustaining.
Hey folks, as we're allowing folks to jump on, I'm asking folks to please put their name, their congregation, and their state in the chat. I've modeled what we would like you to do, so I'd appreciate that. We want to leave as much time as possible for the speakers to speak, so getting you to do this would be immensely helpful. I'm also putting some materials in the chat. So please keep an eye out for those. I'll repeat them later on, but I want you guys to have them as soon as possible. Okay, I think we'll give it another minute or two, and then I'll transition from this welcome slide. And again, just a reminder for the folks who are joining even as I speak, we're asking folks to put into the chat their name, their congregation, and their state. And I've put a couple of links in there so far, and we'll do so further on in the program. But why don't we get started? I'm going to stop my share of this welcoming screen now. Turn on my video. I want to remind folks, hey, my name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the Executive Director of Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. Thank you so much for joining us for our Right Here, Right Now briefing. Our October month topic is centered on the input and counsel of our environmental action team. So we'll be discussing appropriations issues around the EPA and trying to get Congress acting more intelligently and I would use the word faithfully around the issues of environmental justice. But some basic housekeeping to begin with. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to remind you to put in the chat your name, your congregation, and your state. And most of us are old hats at Zoom, but it bears repeating that at the bottom of your dialogue window, you should have a microphone icon that you can use to put yourself on mute or turn on your sound. I'm going to ask that when you're not speaking, you go ahead and put yourself on mute. That way I, as the host, do not have to do it for you, and then also remember to unmute you. If you don't want to be recorded today, I'm going to ask you to turn your video off because we are recording and we feel blessed to be able to do so. We have a great speaker for you that David Shelton, our board member of UUSJ, will speak more in detail about who we have. And this is an example of why I would like you to put yourself on mute. So we don't want that kind of feedback. At the bottom of the same dialog box, you should have an icon that has like a thought bubble. It says chat. You can click on that and put questions in there. I will do my best to monitor that. But increasingly, I'm of a mind that I request that folks try to be present in our conversation and focused on what our speakers are saying and what we are saying as we engage them. You also have the ability to take a look at the participant list at the bottom of the participant list. So if you click onto the participant icon, at the bottom of the participant list is a bunch of buttons. You can do things like raise your electronic hand. That's probably the best way for me to hear that you or see that you want to be recognized when we hit the Q&A portion of our agenda. Once the speakers are done speaking, I and hopefully Anna Hooker, our program assistant, who will be joining us a little later, will be around to demo for you some of the things that we're talking about and to answer any technological or sort of logistics and systems questions that you have. But the first portion of our briefing today is centered on the high-level content that's being provided by our guest speaker. And I guess at this point, I am going to ask you to settle in, focus. I do want to share with you some important upcoming dates. I want to flag for you that on Saturday, the 10th of October, we have a wonderful workshop, a virtual workshop that you can RSVP for. It's centered on storytelling as advocacy. So our workshop coordinator will be helping folks to understand how you can harness the power of your stories to influence public policy and decision makers and really do that primordial work of cracking open a heart so that the cognitive work that you're going to do or present around data or your arguments will actually land in a way that makes a difference. Another event that I think is important to flag for you guys is on the 12th of October, so the following Monday, next Monday, we're going to have a guest speaker from Mighty Earth. Glenn Horowitz, the CEO of Mighty Earth, is going to be speaking with us about some of the concerns around COVID and the pandemic and his global campaigns around deforestation and indigenous rights. He's going to be talking about that complex of issues, and I think it's really exciting, and I hope you'll consider joining us, especially since this conversation is centered on the environmental justice dimension of our work, and clearly including and thinking about disenfranchised and disempowered populations like Glenn will be doing on Monday is an important dimension of that work. I'd like to flag for you that the Right Here, Right Now letters are formally due on the 15th of the month. And I feel called to remind everyone to make a vote plan for the November election. UUSJ has a voter mobilization project. If you're not familiar with it, please go to our homepage and click on a couple of the links we have there. But the main thing is we want everyone to be thinking about a vote plan. because this election is different than any other election in recent memory, both the politics, but also the logistics. The number of ways that you can vote and how you can ensure that your vote is counted in time changes state by state. So it's important to try and think that through. Finally, another exciting opportunity further off in the future, I want to flag that we have on December 12th, a policy briefing with U.S. Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia. He's going to be talking to UUSJ, our friends and supporters, about how UUs can be engaged with the 117th Congress once it's been identified and elected, and in order to make the most important impacts for social justice. And so we feel that it's an exciting opportunity, and we want you to put it on your calendar. And I'll share, it's part of our 20th anniversary celebration. UUSJ is rounding the corner on 20 years trying to build a UU movement for federal advocacy, and we would invite you to celebrate that achievement with us. So finally, I just want to share again that we're talking about environmental justice, we're talking about the EPA's budget, and we're talking about vehicles that can be used to further that work and that thought. And I have a reading that I think sort of sharpens some of this material for us. It's a bit of a long reading, but I'm going to share it with you. Comes out of an article that's produced or distributed by Yale Environment 360. The title of the article, and I'll put it in the chat, is Unequal Impact, the Deep Links Between Racism and Climate Change. It's an interview with Elizabeth Yamperi. She's a Puerto Rican, and I think I want to read her first answer in the interview. Elizabeth says, climate change is the result of a legacy of extraction, of colonialism, of slavery. A lot of times when people talk about environmental justice, they go back to the 1970s or the 1960s. But I think about the slave quarters. I think about the people who got the worst food, the worst healthcare, the worst treatment, and when freed were given the lands that were eventually surrounded by things like petrochemical industries. The idea of killing Black people or indigenous people, all of that has a long, long history that is centered on capitalism and the extraction of our land and our labor in this country. For us, the part of the climate justice movement to separate those things is impossible. The truth is that the climate justice movement, people of color, indigenous people, have always worked multidimensionally because we have been able to fight, because we have to be able to fight on so many different planes. When I first came to this work, I was fighting police brutality at the Puerto Rico Legal Defense Fund. We were fighting for racial justice. We were in our 20s, and this is how we started. It was only a few years after that that I realized that if we couldn't breathe, we couldn't fight for justice. And that's how I got into the environmental justice movement. For us, there is no distinction between one and the other. In our communities, people are suffering from asthma and upper respiratory disease, and we've been fighting for the right to breathe for generations. It's ironic that those are the signs you're seeing in the protests. I can't breathe. When the police are using chokeholds, literally people who suffer from a history of asthma and respiratory disease, their breath is taken away. When Eric Gardner died in 2014, and we heard he had asthma, the first thing we said in my house was, this is an environmental justice issue. The communities that are most impacted by COVID or pollution, it's not surprising that they're the ones that are going to be most impacted by extreme weather events. And it's not surprising that they're the ones that are targeted for racial violence. It's all the same communities all over the United States, and you can't treat one part of the problem without the other because it's so systemic. So I think our briefing today will address one aspect of that, but I also think it's important that as a faith-based organization that's trying to do interconnected, interconnected work, that we keep that largest frame in our minds. And I welcome you to feel as if you're doing really important work, because you are. With that, I'd like to introduce David Shelton. David is a great friend of UUSJ. He's a board member for UUSJ, and he brings to bear a wonderful background and history in this area of work generally. He served as an appellate attorney and then senior litigation counsel in the appellate section of the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice from 1979 to 2017, when he retired from federal government. During that time, he briefed and argued cases in all of the United States Courts of Appeals and in several state Supreme Courts, and assisted the Office of the Solicitor General with drafting Supreme Court briefs and preparing for oral arguments. Mr. Shelton received the division's Muskie Chafee Award for significant contributions to environmental law in 2013. And he's presented on numerous environmental law topics at federal agency and bar association conferences, as well as law schools. He's also taught environmental and administrative law at the University of Oregon Law School, and while on sabbatical from the Department of Justice. So please understand that we have two folks who are going to be presenting to us with deep, deep contextual understanding of what we're talking about. Thanks so much, folks. And with that, I hand it over to David Shelton.
Thank you, Pablo. Appreciate that. And it's really great to see everybody here today. As the reading that Pablo gave us shows us, the problem of environmental justice and environmental injustice has been around for centuries. The concept of environmental justice has really only seeped into the public policy realm, really maybe in the last 30 years. It really started with a series of cases involving waste dumps that were being put in communities, and it bubbled up from those communities who were saying, look, why do we get all the waste dumps? Why do we get all the factory permits? In the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, there was an executive order which started requiring agencies to focus on environmental justice and focus on the disproportionate effects on minority and poor communities of their decisions. But it was only an executive order, didn't have the full force of, say, legislation. And it's been observed, by some agencies more than others, and observed during some administrations more than others. There's been an environmental justice budget in the EPA for a while, but it's been small. There's been an office there for a while. It has been active at some points, less active at others. We're talking about appropriations right now, because that is something which we can actually make some headway on at the moment. As you probably all know, trying to get progressive legislation on environmental issues through Congress these days has been very, very difficult, if not impossible. But every year, Congress has to make a determination of how much money to appropriate for the various agencies and the various parts of agencies. And it gives people some leverage to try and get additional money for good initiatives like environmental justice, and perhaps to place some conditions on agency funding to make sure that good priorities are followed. And we think we've got that opportunity now to talk to our senators about appropriations, and it's in particular the EPA appropriation, because some action has to be taken on appropriations fairly soon. You've probably all heard that there was a continuing resolution to extend funding from the last fiscal year into this fiscal year, which just started on October 1st. And that continuing resolution just keeps agency funding at the levels where they were last year. But a final decision on appropriations has to be made either in the lame duck session of Congress after the election or possibly early next year. And we can make a difference on this by urging senators to increase funding for EPA's environmental justice program and to impose certain conditions on EPA's funding that will lead to more just results. Now, all that might sound a little wonky, but I think it is really based on our faith and and is grounded in our faith. And it's important that we make clear when we write to Congress that we are a faith group with a spiritual grounding, and that promoting environmental justice falls squarely within our UU first principle to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Our second principle, calling for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And our seventh principle, calling for us to respect the interdependent web of all existence. Now, we're really lucky to have speaker David Corson. I had the pleasure of working with David while he was an attorney at EPA, and I was an attorney at the Department of Justice Division that works with EPA on its court cases. David worked on a variety of issues at EPA, including environmental justice, and is well versed in that subject and in appropriations law. Since his retirement, David's been working with the appropriations team at the Environmental Protection Network. The Environmental Protection Network is a group of EPA alumni that's working to preserve the nation's bipartisan progress towards clean air, water, land, and climate protection. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to David Corson.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I think it's useful to sort of get a snapshot of where we are just now with the funding process. I think David gave a good sort of sense of that. But what has actually happened is, right, that the House has approved an EPA appropriation, and now it's up to the Senate to pass its own version. And then if the two would be reconciled, and that would form the final appropriation. Another way this could go is if there is no agreement, there would simply be a permanent continuing resolution, which would follow the funding from the previous year. But in the past, it has tended to be a series of continuing resolutions followed at some point by a budget. In this cycle, the House, having come to Democratic control, has been more expansive in funding EPA. In the first 2 years of the Trump administration, it was quite the reverse. The House was very harsh, and the Senate kind of held the line. But the Senate has been a moderating influence, and I think at this point, the House budget would be a starting point. The House has appropriated about $14 million for the EPA Office of Environmental Justice. And the last year, the appropriation was about $8 million. So there's a fair amount of room between the continuing resolution and a new appropriation. And one of the things that the House paid attention to is identifying things that needed to be expanded or changed with the EPA Environmental Justice Program, recognizing that it was too small, that it only contains about 35 people, and that a program for the entire 14,000 person Environmental Protection Agency with a budget of $9 billion needs to be a bit more robust than that. So at this point, I think the question is, what would go into, what should we ask the Senate to do? And the answer is to fund a vibrant environmental justice program. And that would mean providing funding at the same level as provided by the House. And it would also mean funding activities and programs that support environmental justice, whether they're labeled as environmental justice programs or not. Things like diesel emission reduction grants that can be used to control diesel emissions, which are a source of enormous toxicity in areas near ports and where there's a lot of transit, and to promote safe drinking water, and to build infrastructure for the drinking water. There are a lot of people in the country who don't have even indoor plumbing, and there used to be far more. And so a place to move ahead is with promoting better water infrastructure for communities. And two programs that are already moving in this direction are, there's a program to fund drinking water for Alaska Native villages, and another one for communities in the US-Mexico border area, where there are serious lacks of indoor plumbing. And right now there are 100,000 people on the Navajo reservation who don't have access to indoor plumbing. So a more robust program for funding that would be a very important and valuable thing. And in addition, there are problems with enforcement. The House budget recommended that EPA target enforcement actions toward environmental justice communities, because the reality is that some of the worst pollution, this will come as no surprise to anyone who's paying attention to the environmental justice issue as a whole, but the worst polluters tend to be located near environmental justice communities. And not only that, but the pollution sources that are the most acute, because most pollution is not randomly distributed, but rather there are some facilities that are responsible for a very large portion of all the total toxics that are emitted. Those communities tend to be near, those sort of facilities tend to be near environmental justice communities. So targeting enforcement attention is a way of ensuring that these facilities are complying with the law, and that the heavily polluting facilities are at least complying with the legal requirements. In some cases, they are requiring, they're complying, and the difficulty is the standards aren't tough enough. But a way of starting to address that problem is to look at what's going on near environmental justice communities and making sure that they're fully protected. Another area that's important is there are 9 million homes that receive water from lead pipes, and that needs to be addressed. And there's been a very large $120 billion water infrastructure program over the last 30 years, but a disproportionate share of the communities that have been left behind by that will be, no surprise, environmental justice communities. So finding ways of providing that water infrastructure to those communities is a really important step forward. And the Alaska and border programs can provide models, but it's necessary for Congress to turn its attention to those things, to make sure that those functions and activities are are adequately funded. So there's a lot to sort of look for in an environmental justice budget for the EPA, in addition to, of course, the level of funding for the environmental justice program and for the grants that it issues. Those are both very small. There are about 35 people in the program, in the Office of Environmental Justice. And right now, the grants, there are there's several hundred grants, but each of them is limited to, 50 grants. The limit is 50 grants, and the grants are limited to $30,000 each. So the size of the grant program is very small. The grants are very useful. They can empower the communities so that the communities can speak for themselves, make their environmental needs known, and advocate for what they need. But a more robust program would be very important there, and that is another item that was mentioned by the House Appropriations Committee. So those are some examples of ways in which an EPA budget could more robustly implement environmental justice within the agency and for communities across the country. I guess I'd sort of, at this point, I guess I'd like to see what questions people have or what thoughts they have as we move forward with a discussion here.
Great. So what I'll ask folks to do, I'll remind everyone that I'm monitoring the participants list. I will ask you to raise your hand by going to the participants list, going down to the bottom of that list and clicking on the button that says raise my electronic hand or raise your hand. It would be immensely helpful if we do it that way. First question is from John Peterson of Acatink.
David, thank you for that. I guess I'll call it a speech. I wonder what can be done about the diesel particulate or whatever it is that's causing the asthma and whatever, where diesel vehicles are located.
Well,
That doesn't seem like an easy thing to do.
well, that's an area, it's sort of like non-point source pollution, that although it's not as bad as that, non-point source pollution can't be, there are very limited authorities for directly regulating it. But what we have with diesel emissions is we have a diesel emission reduction grant program, so that funding is made available and can be used to encourage sources of diesel pollution to reduce their emissions and to control them. Because as you know, diesel emissions are an enormous problem, and particularly in communities that are located close to transit corridors and with shipping. But even where those emissions can't be regulated, the emission reduction grants can be used to provide incentives so that without necessarily imposing a regulation or enforcing the regulation, the funding is there to do things that will effectively reduce and redirect the emissions. So that's a very that's sort of a non-regulatory program. It's a very important program, and I think it's useful to recognize that it's one of the programs from the beginning, along with environmental justice, which the Trump administration wanted to eliminate. But every year they have opposed any funding for the diesel emission reduction program, and every year Congress has fully funded it. So it has a lot of support, and but that is a very useful tool in that regard. But I think in general, looking for mechanisms for providing incentives is one way of going beyond what regulations can do. So that, for instance, where I talked about the super polluters near environmental justice communities, if they're complying with their legal standards, there may be regulatory steps that would be difficult to take. But if there are ways of reducing the emissions that are non-regulatory, but where there are incentives provided, that's another way of going.
Thanks so much, John and David. Our next question is from Mr. Shelton.
Yeah, David, looking at what the House did at the last minute, in July, when the House passed its appropriations for EPA, I believe there was an amendment relating to EPA's recent rule on particulate emissions. Particulate emissions have very strong health impacts, including on COVID-19. I believe the agency scientists had recommended that EPA tighten those emission standards, but the EPA eventually said, no, we're not going to do it. And they did it in a way that will make it very difficult to ever tighten them again. I believe there was a condition put on by the House that would block that effort. Is there some room in the Senate for supporting that?
Well, yes and no. I'd like to just say yes, but one of the things that has happened over the years is that riders have been put into appropriations acts that don't appropriate funding, but rather that establish policy. And there's been, every year there are a lot of rather mischievous riders that are attached to appropriations acts. And now that the Democrats are in control of the House, there are also some constructive ones. But there's a desire among the senior appropriators to have clean appropriations acts without riders. And in this instance, that would mean not including this language in the Senate measure. And it's very, very, Chairman Shelby of the Appropriations Committee feels very strongly that they want to get rid of, not have any riders there. Already sort of waffling by saying, well, legacy riders, that is riders that have been in for some years, will remain, but you can't put new ones in. So I wouldn't hold that much hope for that.
So it sounds like our focus should be on the other measures. Probably we wouldn't make any progress with these riders. Thank you. That's helpful.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, David. And David, Bill Harris has the next question, and I encourage folks to raise their electronic hand if they have additional questions.
Regarding diesel as a source of toxicity for life, it's notable, I think, that California has gone pretty far in requiring a certain change in diesel trucks to make them cleaner than they were before. So much so that we in Oregon are getting some used trucks that are not too clean coming out of California. This is a situation in which the life of impacted people and toxicity to people is intersecting with the climate crisis problem of greenhouse gas. For the right answer down the line is not only attempts to regulate to cleaner engines, but to electrify the transportation fleet. And I don't know exactly where in federal legislation, I don't know the present status of climate change, and specifically that having to do with promoting electric transportation federally is. But this is certainly an important intersection. Thank you.
Well, I think that's exactly right. But I think there's been an ongoing tug of war between the administration and California and other states about vehicle emissions as a general matter. And the federal government has decided that the agreements that were negotiated in exchange for the bailout of the auto industry are too onerous for the industry. And so there's now an effort to prevent California from setting its own emission standards. And that's a subject of litigation. I'm not sure that EPA has the stronger legal position there. But those things are very hard to manage through funding. I think if you have incentives that you can create that make it desirable to build, to use electric vehicles, that's one way of going. And another way is using emission standards, developing and implementing emission standards that can't be met without a substantial mix of electric vehicles in a fleet. And that was to some extent what the Obama proposal was doing. And that's very much to a very large extent something that the Trump administration is trying to get rid of. But I think that the other thing about the diesel and the trucks is that there was a proposal to allow to deregulate certain truck bodies that were reconditioned, and to allow the vehicle emission standards to apply as to allow the standards that existed at the time the engines were built to remain effective without requiring any new controls. And that was a big initiative of the Pruitt administration, but I don't think it was successful.
Thanks so much. I just want to flag for folks that after we're done with the speaker comments and the Q&A, I am going to demo some of the tools related to our Right Here, Right Now program. So I encourage you to stay on. But our next question is from Bob Deniston and then Kelly Perry.
David, thanks for your great overview and also for the article in The Hill back in August. Very illuminating. My question relates to the health disparities that the communities you speak of already suffer. And clearly diesel particulates, poor water quality, et cetera, exacerbate the existing problems, plus increase risk to COVID and not only getting it, but also dying from it. But what's the counter argument? Who's pushing back against this? It seems like a matter to some of us, it's a simple matter of justice to provide funds to communities so they can organize and combat some of the things that really put them at the point of ever worsening health disparities.
Well, I think the challenge with the diesel emissions in particular is just the limitations on regulatory tools, so that there are limited ways of compelling change. And this is more generally, this is a problem across the universe of environmental justice. You have these communities that have all sorts of nasty facilities nearby, and there really is no point of decision other than if a facility wants a new permit or modify an existing permit. But it's very hard to address the conglomerations of facilities, the clusters that have been created in the past, because environmental law tends to be forward-looking. And that's a dimension of environmental justice that people are going to have to think a lot about. I think that's one place where incentives and I think community empowerment are going to be very important. But it's very hard to tell a facility that's been operating for years and that's complying with the law that it has to shut down. And there are a few air programs that do that, but not very many. But that I think is one of the limitations of regulatory environmental justice as a tool for managing the environmental justice problem.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I want to invite Kelly to share her question, and then we have 2 more questions, and I think we'll tie it off there.
Thank you again for your introduction. Can you clarify when you were talking about Bill Harris's question for diesel trucks, is that anything related to the glider kits that people talk about?
Yes, I was actually talking about the glider rule.
Okay.
I didn't work on it, but some colleagues of mine who were really outraged did. And it was largely a favor that Mr. Pruitt did to a small truck manufacturing company. I don't think that the glider rule actually went forward. It was a very retrograde way of undoing progress that was being made, and it produced limited economic benefit to very few people and enormous environmental harm, because the old to be disused and unreconditioned engines were very damaging and very harmful. But I think this is one of the big challenges with environmental protection is looking at where what kinds of activities have enormous harmful public impacts, and instead of looking at the cost to industry of compliance, look at the cost to the community, the cost that facilities and activities are imposing on communities, and looking for ways stopping these facilities and equipment from externalizing their costs by simply imposing them on the public, but rather to pay a fair cost that reflects the burdens that they're imposing.
Thank you. And did you have any experience with the Tennessee ash fly spill and the waste was dumped in, I believe, Alabama in a environmental justice community? Do you know what I'm referring to?
I do in a general way. I don't have any sort of hands-on knowledge with that, but I think again, it reflects a sort of difficulty developing regulatory standards that don't exist, and imposing these regulatory limitations on facilities. And it really has to do again with the fact that environmental law has not been as good as we would like at forcing polluters to internalize the costs of the negative externalities, the public harms that they create. And this was an example of that. But I think the other place that happens with the coal ash, I think, is just that the facilities are able to sort of benefit from uncertainty. That if it's the risk of uncertainty about environmental consequences is often borne by the public, because the certainty isn't clear enough to justify imposing the costs of managing the waste on the facilities, but the facilities are getting all of the benefits. And so it may be a problem with either the environmental law or with the regulations that implement the law. But it's certainly an incomplete way of addressing things. And it creates, and it's as another example where these communities are powerless and marginalized. And so they become sort of waste dumping areas in one way or another. Usually the dumping isn't quite as literal as the one we're talking about here, but it's communities that are, and we found this with our study of the worst polluting facilities and how often they're close to environmental justice communities. They go where there's less resistance, where there is less power to control and manage them, to where they bear fewer consequences for their actions. And it's just not fair.
Thank you. Our next question is from Nadine.
Hi there. Thanks so much for your time, David. I heard a number of things in your answers that compel me to ask a question. So you said that there's limited ways of compelling change and that there are limitations in a regulatory approach to reducing greenhouse gases and the related pollutants. So I'm wondering if you have an opinion on a market-based approach that would put a price on pollution, like a carbon tax, that would be simpler, and not that it needs to be done by itself, but that my understanding is, like, the person who was a leader in the drawdown movement said that carbon price would accelerate all these other tools that we're trying to use. So taking those externalities and having a price put on them. So I'm just wanting to see if you have a comment on that.
Well, I don't directly, because I haven't thought about it much, but it sort of flows out of the observations that I was just making about ensuring that people who impose public harms bear the costs of the harms that they create, so that they internalize them and pay them themselves, rather than imposing them on the public without any consequences. So methods of pricing pollution, while they sound cynical and defeatist, are actually incentives are very powerful in our society. And one of the things we found with regulatory costs historically is that the estimated costs of compliance with regulation, they're always enormously ruinous. We can't possibly do that. And then if the answer is, well, you absolutely have to, then instead of the ingenuity that's used in crafting arguments about why it can't be done, some of that innovation is used to figure out ways of doing things lawfully and less expensively. And carbon pricing is a way of sort of systematizing that, so that the carbon emitters are always thinking about that, because they pay a price when they emit, and there is a saving to them if they can come up with a way of doing it more effectively. So it's a very effective market-based tool. I'm not a big fan of the market, but I think it can do a lot of things, and it has a kind of public legitimacy that more command and control kinds of regulations sometimes don't have.
Thank you. There are some bills in Congress that do just that, and do so without negatively impacting people who are a low and moderate income, where they take those monies and give the dividends, they return it to American households in the form of a dividend. So I would just say I'd like to see that at least entertained in some of the requests that we're making for environmental justice action from the Senate and the House next year.
Well, that was actually being done, I think, early in the Obama administration. There was a carbon tax program, I think, and it was defeated by the filibuster, which I think I'm going to predict that if the Democrats take the Senate, the filibuster will be a vestige of the days of segregation. And without that, you'll be talking about where there's majority support for a concept like that, and it won't be so possible to block it and block the will of the public for these very necessary changes.
Thank you.
And last question to Terry Grogan.
Hi, thank you. A quick question about the request that we'd be making to the Senate. Clearly, increased funding for the Environmental Justice Office is a part of it. And it sounds like we can look to the House bill for a model of the scale that might be needed. You had also mentioned some programmatic issues on things like water infrastructure, lead pipes, the link between the exposure to pollution and susceptibility to COVID. Can I ask, were those addressed in the House bill, and would referring to the House bill again be a good approach to kind of give a model for the Senate?
Well, to a limited extent, but one of the things that the House bill also included an enormous supplemental appropriation for EPA. It was treated as an emergency matter, so it wasn't subject to budget caps. And it provided a lot of money for several of the activities and things that I've talked about here, outside of the outside of the budget caps and outside of the budget and outside of the standard budget. So it was additional money. And one of the things I was struck by is how many of those things like diesel emission grants were things that would assist environmental justice communities. What I was also struck by is the fact that there wasn't the words environmental justice did not appear in the supplemental funding. So I think people know what kinds of steps will help will benefit environmental justice communities, but they're not labeled as environmental justice measures. And so I think the challenge is to identify them and encourage the funding with or without the label. And the lead pipes are an intractable problem, but I think that's a place where there's a lot of infrastructure money, and I think some of it needs to go for that particular purpose, because there's so many people, even years after Flint, that are getting water through lead pipes. It's very expensive, but it will have enormous benefits if we get rid of it, or conversely, enormous harms if we don't.
Well, with that, I want to thank David and David for their wonderful comments. I want to transition at this point, and I'm going to invite folks to, yes, do as Mary Richards has and press your reactions icon at the bottom of your screen and show your appreciation and praise for David and David. I'm about to transition into some demoing of what we're wanting to do with this right here, right now. But I want to underscore something I'm about to put in the chat in a few minutes, and maybe Anna will do it herself. Anna Hooker is our program assistant for Advocacy Corps and Right Here, Right Now, and she's joined the call. And if you're writing a letter and you're interested in joining David Shelton and our environmental action team, potentially for any of our Hill meetings, I encourage you to email Anna and let her know. And remember, increasingly with UUSJ, you have the opportunity to not only write a letter, and we'll show you how, but also join in the advocacy conversation that backs up your letter. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And just give me a moment to do that.
I'll go.
So just really quickly, I want to show you our front page. I want to show you that the Right Here, Right Now information is up here in what we would call our widget 2, or this sort of call out box. October, Right Here, Right Now, urge senators to promote environmental justice by providing increased funding to environmental justice programs in impacted communities. So you have access to the handout right here. You can also follow some links around engaging around voter mobilization. And there's also a link for the storytelling advocacy workshop that I mentioned. A flag for you, it's not here, but we'll get it up on the screen. We have this Indigenous Communities and Fight for Climate Justice Amid the Pandemic talk on Monday, October 12th with Glenn Hurwitz that I mentioned at the top of our call. And you basically get you'll go to these pages and you'll be able to RSVP for these items. So our first item that I want to show you is our classic Right Here, Right Now handout. This is the material that David and Kelly and Lavona and Bob Deniston and Anna and others have all collaborated to pull together for you. It gives you the basic information about our program, the delivery date for letters, where you can send them if you're going to send them through the mail. It gives you a link to the online platform that you can use. It also gives you a link to the submission form if you want to upload a letter that you've written at your desk or table. Share with you the background. We share with you the UU grounding. We highlight the key ask that we think makes sense this month, this issue. We provide to you suggested talking points that you could incorporate in your letters that you're using to back up your personal stories. And then we articulate for you a quick sample letter for how you could structure some of this. And so I invite you to look in the chat, which I've placed the link there to this document. But you can also follow the link here where it says try doing an individual letter online. And it's also in the chat, and it will take you to, oh, that's the registration page. Sorry about that. It will take you to this platform. It's an online platform that allows you to follow along and write in a very similar way your message to your senator. So we've started for you a little paragraph here. We've highlighted the optional choice to include the name of your congregation in your location, but strictly speaking, it's not necessary. And then we encourage you to think about this as a white piece of paper or a legal pad and write your letter to Congress. When you're done, you can press click here to send. And yes, this little gray dot here shows you usually it populates the senior senator or whoever's in the queue first, but the second dot shows you the other person. So there you go. You're sending your right here, right now letters not only to your senators, but also to UUSJ. And again, we give you the information, some of the information that you see in the right here, right now handout. We've provided to you a link back to the handout that many of you are very familiar with. And we've done this in part because we heard from right here, right now participants that over the course of the summer and in reaction to the pandemic, that without the forum of your congregations and your sanctuaries to grab people by their elbows and hand them a copy of the handout and say, would you please sit down and spend 10 minutes to write a letter about this issue, that it was increasingly important to send along links, or at least offer it as an opportunity to send along links to your networks and implore people to fill them out. So this is an option for you. We also have, oh, I just wanted to quickly show the article that Bob Dennison mentioned that David Person authored. Here it is. And then we have for you, again, accessible through the submission, through the handout, a link that goes to a submission form where you can upload both packets on behalf of your congregation, because some of you are sort of the point of contact or the congregational captain for the Right Here, Right Now program, or your individual letters, and this will get uploaded into our website. And then Anna or another person will go through and make sure that your packet is associated with your name, your state, and your congregation. So you can select here and say this is an individual letter. You could toggle this button and it would tell us that it's a congregational button. And then we take follow-on steps that amount to reaching out to the staffers that the team has identified and delivering those letters on your behalf and driving a conversation with the staffer that has expertise in that area. I'm going to stop share for a moment because I'd like Anna Hooker to speak and just introduce herself to you, because she is your point of contact for the program and your first line of answering questions. So Anna, would you speak?
Sure. Hi, my name is Anna. It's nice to see a lot of your faces because I've just seen your email addresses so far. So it's always nice to put a face with a name. I'll go ahead and put my email in here as well too. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me there.
So typically at this stage in our program, we like to go into breakout rooms. So I'm about to assign everyone in a breakout room. I will probably stay in the main salon as the host, so don't expect to see me. And I'll give you about, I think it's 10, 15 minutes at this point to talk about the issues, raise any concerns that you might want to share that are on your hearts and what you're thinking about the issue. And then I'll give you about a 3-minute warning that I'm going to pull everyone back into the main salon, and essentially we'll conclude at that point. But I will linger to Anna and I will linger to answer any questions. So here we go. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and please discuss the issue and how you intend to craft a story or which talking points are most meaningful to you.